Joined now by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He is a professor of medicine, economics, and health research policy at Stanford. He's director of Stanford's Center for Demography and Economics of Healthcare. He has a BA from Stanford, an MA from Stanford, an MD from Stanford, and a PhD in economics, so he's not just your average bag of donuts. Dr. Bhattacharya, welcome. It's great for you to join me early. I appreciate it.
It's my honor for you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you are widely considered to be the calmest, most reasonable, and most persuasive critic of the public health policies of the last two administrations when it comes to COVID. And I want to look mostly forward, not backwards. But you're also the author of the Great Barrington Declaration, along with Martin Kulldorff and Sunitra Gupta, and a figure of some controversy in the medical community, though not with me. You're Larry Arnn's friend, which means you have extraordinary patience. But at the end, or at the midpoint, we're at the midpoint of looking at the COVID health policy. How do you describe yourself in the public eye? What do you stand for in the eyes of everybody generally?
Well, my main argument during COVID is that we had to take account of the basic epidemiological facts about it in designing our policy. And that is that it was, well, there's two really. One, that there is a enormous age gradient in the risk of dying from COVID if you get COVID, right? It's older people primarily that have died. It's 80% of the deaths are people over 65. And whereas children face minuscule risk relative to other risks in their lives. That's fact one. I think nobody disagrees with that. Fact two is that the lockdowns that we employed are harmful. They're really, really deeply harmful, particularly to children, particularly to the poor, particularly to the working class. They are harmful. I've called them trickle-down epidemiology. The theory seems to be that if we protect, relatively well-off people, that we'll protect everybody. But in fact, that's not true. The disease spread despite the lockdowns, and the lockdowns caused tremendous. I mean, we can go through some of the litany of the harms they're caused, but it's catastrophic. I can't think of any public health intervention in modern history, certainly outside of wartime, that have had the same kind of catastrophic effects, including large numbers of people around the world thrown into poverty, starvation. It's just heartbreaking, Hugh. So if you put those two facts together, the right policy always was and still is focused protection of vulnerable people, older people, primarily, by whatever technologies we have. It could have been vaccination. It was vaccinations when we once had them. Before vaccinations, we should have been much more creative about protecting older people, and lifting lockdowns, not doing school closures, not doing, the whole litany of panic mongering, sort of chicken with a head cut off kind of policies we followed with a hope of slowing the spread when it was just basically futile to do so. We had some possibility of protecting vulnerable people. We had no possibility of stopping the disease from spreading from the moment we learned about this in late January 2020.
I want the audience who is new to me to know where I come from. So they might have come to this interview because you're there, Dr. J, and they have no idea who I am. So full disclosure for that audience who's listening, I was an early alarmist about the pandemic. Senator Cotton was on this show sounding the alarm about what was going on in Wuhan. I am greatly influenced by The Great Influenza, a book I'm sure you've read many times. I am a child of the polio era. My brother is a PhD toxicologist. I talked with him all the time about the science. So I was for the lockdowns. I was for social distancing. I was for masking outside. And when I was that way, I had early access to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, guests on the show each 3 or 4 times. But I grew increasingly skeptical as the data arrived that showed that the mortality was not going to get my grandkids, wasn't going to get my kids, it was going to get me. And so I began to change. I was very glad my grandkids were in England where they could go to school. They weren't shut out of school because they were deployed abroad, and England did the right thing on schools. So what I'm mostly concerned about, and then Dr. Fauci stopped coming on after I asked him if he'd consider quitting because he'd lost confidence. I am now at the point where I'm very happy to have vaccines. I'm going to go get the booster. I can't wait to get the booster. I think if you're over 65, you ought to get the booster. So I want to start there with older people. What do you think about the efficacy of this generation of vaccines for COVID?
Well, it's really hard to say because what normally what you would have is solid randomized trial data. And with the original vaccines that were released in December of 2020, we had that. We had very very large scale trials with clinical endpoints that were meaningful. Protection against symptomatic infection that was at 95%. Now it's not as I would like to have seen a trial designed to measure protection against severe disease or death. We didn't have that, but we had something that I was comfortable enough to say, yeah, this is going to protect vulnerable older people. In fact, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that. With this booster, we don't have those data. We don't have a trial like that. We don't have a large scale trial like that. And the other thing about the difference between now and then is that we have a very different immunological environment. And what I mean by that is that almost everybody's had COVID and recovered. It's basically not possible unless you are, Howard Hughes like in some cave where someone's serving you to have avoided COVID this whole time. And so what that means is that you have already innate protection acquired by the fact that you recovered from COVID, which means that the marginal benefit of any booster at this point is likely to be much lower than it was when you were immune naive.
Interesting, doctor. Just using myself as an example, I tell people I've never had COVID because I haven't been sick since the disease arrived, and I got the booster, and I mean the vaccine and 2 boosters, and I don't think I've had it. But you're suggesting maybe I did, and I just had a mild case and didn't even notice it?
It's quite possible. I mean, you have the vaccine that it tends to reduce the severity of the disease. So it's very likely that you've had COVID. Now, obviously, I haven't lived in your shoes, Hugh, the whole time, so I can't tell for sure.
Right.
But it's
I've been everywhere. So yeah, I've been abroad. I mean, I've traveled in with people who had COVID. I've been to parties, etc. What I want to get to, doctor, the most important thing is the future. I called Mycroft. I have 2 older brothers, Sherlock and Mycroft. They're much smarter than I am. I called Mycroft, the PhD like you, but he's a toxicologist. I said, what's the biggest threat right now? He said, well, there are 5 viruses out there which might go viral and become pandemic. He named Crimea something or other. He ran them off, and I can't remember, and I couldn't write them down fast enough. The issue for me now is what do we do to rebuild public health credibility? Because do you agree with me? It's shattered. It's in shreds. What do you think of U.S. Public Health Authority credibility right now?
I entirely agree with you. It is absolutely it's in the lowest point I've ever seen in my professional career, and unfortunately, I have to say it's well deserved that it's in shreds. Over and over, the top public health authorities in this country, including Tony Fauci, it's understandable. You are put in this position where you have to be the spokesperson for the entire all of public health. And you have a disease that's where the knowledge about it is rapidly coming in. It's like new things are coming in all the time, and so it's hard to stay up. I mean, it's hard. It's been hard enough for me to stay up, and I'm not facing that kind of public scrutiny as he was facing. But at that point, you have to be honest about what you know and you don't know, and you cannot manipulate the public. And unfortunately, that's exactly what Tony Fauci did from almost the first moment of the pandemic, right? If you look at FOIA emails early on from January 2020 between him and Francis Collins, they're basically organizing a cover-up about where this virus came from, about the possibility of a lab leak. They destroyed the careers or attempted to destroy the careers of anyone who suggested it was a lab leak, calling it a conspiracy theory. Then later, just shortly afterwards, in February 2020, Tony Fauci got on TV and said that you shouldn't wear masks. You don't need masks. Actually, he was reflecting the honest consensus then of all scientists, or most scientists. If you looked at the randomized trial evidence before the pandemic regarding masks and the spread of influenza, the conclusion was that you don't have any evidence that it actually works. Masking, not like if you're masking by someone, a trained surgeon wearing a mask in a surgical. I mean, that's a very different thing, right? So he was telling the truth then, but then a month later, he turns around and says, "Oh no, I was lying to you. I was lying to you because I wanted to protect hospital workers." Well, I mean, once you've admitted that, you've lost credibility. and then you had people. Then there was the in mid-July. There were actually people in the United States were pretty solid on school opening, reflecting what had happened in Europe, in Sweden and Iceland and elsewhere. Um, and people were in favor of school opening. All of a sudden, it seemed like on a dime it would turn against school opening, not based on any real data that had come out, but it looked to me like basically a political switch, as if it was as using kids to get at Donald Trump, make him make his reelection chances worse. I mean, I think so. There was that element of noble lies, that element of politicization. Then there was the BLM protests, right? So the Sturgis bike rally happens, and Republicans gathering to celebrate Harleys is dangerous, but then Democrats gathering to protest. Actually, it wasn't just Democrats; lots of people gathering to protest racial injustice is somehow okay. People, and you have public health signing a letter, 1,000 people in public health signing letters saying that that's okay for public health, but not the other protests. I mean, it's so obvious to the public that public health wasn't simply reflecting science.
Now, Doctor, I move very cautiously on these things because I'm not a scientist. Science is the last thing I do. I'm a lawyer and a broadcaster, but I try and read widely. So Dr. Fauci began to lose me after my second interview when he told me we had not funded gain of function research in China, and it became obvious that we had funded gain of function research in China, but he was afraid of that. And then the emails came out where he and Dr. Collins are talking about suppressing that news. I think that's what they were talking about. I don't want to slander anyone or libel anyone. But then the mask flip-flop. There were just lots of things going wrong. At what point did you, Jay Bhattacharya, lose confidence in them as long-time and I think widely respected authorities in the area of public health?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I've long respected both Tony Fauci and Francis Collins. Francis Collins, of course, is famously a very public about his Christianity. I'm a Christian,
yes,
and I've long admired that. And of course, he is was the head of the Human Genome Project, probably the most important project of the second half of the 20th century in science. And Tony Fauci is longtime head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, has this long distinguished career in advising presidents on how to manage epidemics in this country. On my bookshelf, I still have a textbook of his that I read when I was in medical school, this Harrison's Internal Medicine. I mean, so I had the greatest respect for both of them at the onset of the pandemic. In fact, I was asked.
When did you lose it?
I mean, I think so. In March of 2020, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal pointing out that we didn't really know the infection fatality rate, and I called for a study to measure the infection fatality rate. In April of 2020, I ran that study in Santa Clara County, measuring antibodies in the population at large in Santa Clara County, California. Then another one in LA County, another one with Major League Baseball that later that month. All three studies pointed to pretty widespread, 3-4% of the population already had antibodies in California at that point, like major metropolitan areas in California in the community. That meant the disease was already out there. That meant that you couldn't really hope to stop it at zero. It was obviously a very, very highly infectious, easily spread disease. It was clear that it was aerosolized to me from that Chinese that Chinese restaurant study that done, where one person had it and then another person got it the other side of the restaurant from the fan blowing. I'm like, okay, that's an aerosolized disease. And so I took from that it was not possible to stop it. We kind of really needed to protect vulnerable people. But instead, I saw Tony Fauci in April, May, June 2020 excoriating governors that were taking sensible steps to try to get schools open, try to get people sort of starting to live more normal lives, and also start trying to think about how to better protect vulnerable older people. And it was so obviously political. Like he was saying, when Kemp opens up in Georgia, he says it's irresponsible. When DeSantis opens up in Florida, it's irresponsible. When Kristi Noem in South Dakota opens up, he says it's irresponsible. Instead of working with them to try to help them figure out how to better protect older people, Instead, he's excoriating them using his position as a top scientific leader. It looked like to me like to score political points. Sometime in summer.
And a charismatic, lovable guy. This is what you've got to be worried about in the future: is charismatic, lovable people with high Q at the beginning of a crisis, not yielding to information flows, but keeping their position at center stage with the microphone. My question now goes to something I talked about with Mycroft last night. When the next one comes, we need to know. First thing we need to know is, what does it do to kids? Because that is the most, the 1917 to 1920 influenza killed children and young adults, and people would drop dead. We need to know that right away. I don't know who we're going to trust, because I just talking to Bethany Mandel. You're on her 95% rate. Emily Oster dropped down to 70%. We got RFK Jr., who's in my 10%. We got people all across the credibility spectrum. I mean, Fauci and Collins are way down there now. Who do you respect outside of you and your colleagues when it comes to the next pandemic, Doctor?
I've been thinking about this. About first what we have to do. I think the idea that you can, for something like this, where it's so complicated, where it is, Hugh, I have a lot of, I've respected you for decades, but I have a lot of sympathy for the position you were in, because now you had to, you're facing this very, very complicated situation. It's the same situation basically everyone in the world was in. You're looking for a single guru to say, okay, this person knows, is a mistake. That, I think, was the biggest mistake. What we have to do is we have to foster a culture where people in public health at the top of the field can disagree honestly without someone fearing for their career, with smearing and slandering and attacks. I mean, unfortunately, that's exactly the environment we're in. So when we wrote Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, and then Sunetra Gupta of Oxford, we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration in October of 2020. That was a document that called for focused protection of vulnerable older people and for lifting lockdowns. Francis Collins wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me and Martin and Sunetra fringe epidemiologists, and then called for a devastating takedown. That kind of attitude basically meant that the public was not going to get an honest assessment of what scientists were actually saying about how to control the disease, or what the nature of the disease was, or the harms of lockdown.
Wasn't that the Galileo reflex? I mean, that was the Vatican of science, Fauci and Collins and the CDC, deciding that the Galileos of the Great Barrington Declaration were going to be jailed. Not physically, but intellectually.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to. The devastating takedown was what he wanted. I mean, I felt it. I mean, they were giving interviews to the Washington Post, calling me a fringe epidemiologist. Fauci was out there saying I wanted to let the virus rip, when what I really wanted to do was protect vulnerable older people. I mean, that's what the heart and soul of that declaration was. The irony, though, is it wasn't even Galileo. Galileo was saying something truly novel, right? The Earth revolves around the sun. We were saying something entirely. Entirely old. Like, it was the old way we handled every single other respiratory virus pandemic for a century. That 1918 pandemic we mishandled, and of course it was a bad pandemic for other reasons. It was on the tail end of World War One. Our population was, it really hit a lot of young people, young men who'd been just come back from war. And we are a very different place. But through the last century, what we did was focus protection of vulnerable older people, right? In 1956, 1968, 1976, as soon ago as 2009, then swine flu. What we did is we said, okay, who's most vulnerable? Let's deploy treatments and vaccines, if we can get them as rapidly as we can, to those populations. Let's try to protect those populations while not disrupting the rest of society. I mean, that was the standard pandemic plan. That's all we were saying with the Great Barrington Declaration. They were destroying the old pandemic plan more than even us.
Doctor, I want to ask you about collective memory of a society, because I am the youngest person on the air who can remember the polio vaccine. But the polio vaccine definitely is in Tony Fauci's mind. It's Mitch McConnell's book is very moving about he got polio at the age of 2. So it's in the minds of everyone who's 65 and older. And they know, oh, gosh, we've got to protect kids, close the pools, keep them away from people. That's in their mind. Some of us had read The Great Influenza because George W. Bush was pushing that book for a reason when H1N1 came around. That was in our mind. My brother had scarlet fever. He got quarantined. There was a public consciousness of threat. And of course, the 1968 episode with flu was bad, and the swine flu was unique in some respects. What is the public consciousness now? Because we may have gone to the other side. I was overprotective, overreactive because I was alarmed, especially for children. Do you think we've gone to the other side now that it's going to be impossible to reestablish the right risk approach to a different, say, something like Ebola or somewhere in between Ebola and COVID, which moves fast but not so fast as to burn out?
I mean, the key thing is the risk characteristics and the transmission of the methods of transmission for whatever the next pandemic is. I think actually even before we get to that, I think we first need to do a postmortem on this one, right? So I've
Yes.
written this document with some of my colleagues. It's a document called the Norfolk Group document. It's a blueprint for an honest COVID commission would look like. Norfolk Group. It's 80 pages of questions. It's not. I mean, none of it is about who did what wrong. It's about what did we do wrong? What could we have known better? How could we have done better? That's the nature of the question. It's like after somebody dies in a hospital, often you'll have a morbidity and mortality conference. All the doctors and nurses will get together and say, why did this patient die? The goal isn't to like point fingers. We've been talking about people that I think failed, but I don't think that's the real reason. That's not the real way to go. The real way to go is to say, okay, what systems failed? How can we reform those systems? How did they fail? How can we reform those systems so they don't fail again? That's the key, I think. And in the next pandemic, we have to learn very, very rapidly as we possibly can in an honest way, what are who's most at risk, and then how does this transmit, right? So I think maybe people's minds might have been SARS-1. In that pandemic, it sort of petered out, right? And partly it petered out because the transmission, the way it worked primarily for SARS-1, I think, we don't know for certain, but I think was fomite, that is surface transmission. So someone sneezes on a surface, someone touches the surface, touches their eye, you get it, right? That's going to spread much less easily than aerosol transmission, where it just spreads by breathing, right? You just breathe and it stays in the air. And so you had some hope of sort of. The other thing is it was really hard to get this unless the SARS-1. If you had a fever, you had it. If you didn't have a fever, you probably didn't have it. You probably couldn't spread it. Those two facts meant SARS-1 was going to die out, which it did. Right, you saw it flared up in China, flared up in like Toronto and a couple of places, and then it went away. It's a very, very different kind of thing where you wouldn't even dream about society-wide lockdowns there. What you do is you'd do symptom checking, and then quarantining of older of people, and then protecting vulnerable people. In that case, it was older people that were dying from it that were most at risk. So you make sure they're not.
Are there some viruses out there, theoretically or reality, in which you could see yourself saying we have to lock down, that you're open to the possibility that we might have to do that if the right epidemiological evidence appears that it threatens children and younger people, that sort of thing?
I think that it's actually funny because I don't know that there's the answer is yes, but I think it's a very, very narrow range of epidemiological circumstances where that would be the case. Right,
I agree.
I think. I think the key thing is, would a lockdown actually stop the trend? So I think one of the things we have to understand about lockdown is that our societies are deeply unequal, and not everybody's equally capable of abiding by a lockdown. There's nothing morally wrong with being in a situation where you can't lock down, right? Some doctors who are in the front line couldn't lock down, right? So a lot of poor people around the world were in a position where they couldn't lock down. If you lock down, you can't feed your family. Your family starves. So you have a situation where a lockdown, if you're going to ask the public to do it, you basically are asking a subset of the public to do it, because most of the public won't be able to abide it for very long. So that's you have to have that in the back of your mind. The second thing about lockdown, I mean, let's leave aside the harms of it. In terms of its efficacy of stopping the thing, I mean, the theory of a lockdown is that you keep people apart from each other, physically distanced from each other, right? And if you keep people physically distanced, they won't spread the disease. And for this disease, it was the theory was that it can spread asymptomatically. You have no symptoms and you can spread it. I think that's true. I don't think it's responsible for a very large fraction of the disease, but it's certainly responsible for some of the disease.
Doctor,
oh, please.
I want to talk to you about the early response and go back to something I talked about with Mycroft. When hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin came out, I was treated with ivermectin during an exposure early on by my doctors, the only thing around, early on. And it wasn't a big deal. We went to the pharmacy, you got the ivermectin. My doctor's a cautious guy. I said, try it. I don't know if it works, but it's better than nothing. There was this reflexive rejection of everything that come out of Washington. That was wrong. Mycroft told me we never did a double-blind study on ivermectin. That's one of the things that Tony Fauci and Dr. Collins both promised me they would do, and they never did it. What happened there? Why didn't we experiment with everything until we got the new thing?
That was a failure, a complete failure. We actually did do a double-blind study, but it was published in late 2022. It's called an active 6 study. The failure was not doing it in 2020. There were a whole bunch of relatively small-scale studies with ivermectin that were actually quite promising, including some randomized studies in 2020. There was some studies with hydroxychloroquine, I think less promising, they were done with by small teams in faraway countries. And in the United States, people said, "Oh, well, gosh, well, we haven't done one here, so we don't know for sure. Why would we trust something that was a study was run in Qatar or something?" I don't really understand that. I think we learned a lot from science done in faraway countries. But even if you accept that, I think the failure is, Tony Fauci sits on top of $10 billion of money for research. Why didn't he run a double-blind, large-scale randomized trial for ivermectin, for fluvoxamine, for hydroxychloroquine, for all these? We would have depoliticized them, right? Instead of saying, "Oh, this is horse paste," we'd have had an answer that would have been acceptable to the vast majority of people in the United States. And that's his failure. He sits on that money. He should have run that. Instead, one thing he did well is he did cooperate and help support the studies for the vaccine. You should have done the same thing for the other treatments.
Well, my theory, from an outsider, again, no science, is that the octopus effect of the narrative took over. This general octopus narrative went into the New York Times via a first-person account of one of their reporters who was middle-aged and got very, very sick, and it scared the hell out of people. And then we had Andrew Cuomo doing his thing, and we had the big debate, and former President Trump and Fauci and Dr. Birx, everyone telling all the narrative became, boy, it's risky out there. We're all going to die. And that meant we don't have any time except to do lockdowns, shutdowns. We can't do double-blind studies. We've got to avoid that the next time. And now the biggest problem, the counter factual extremes. And I hope you will agree with me, some people said very irresponsible things. I don't want to blame anything about how to approach the virus. And they got traction in some places of the internet. What do we do about them? I'm sure you know some people that you thought just said crazy stuff in the opposite direction of what the narrative was saying. What do we do about them the next time around?
I don't think you can avoid it. I mean, our information environment is such that it's going to have people saying things that are just not true, especially in an environment where you don't know what's true, right? You haven't done the science. I think the only answer is to have at the center multiple voices. I mean, I don't know if you must have read Team of Rivals.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I mean, that's the kind of spirit we need with this. We need advisors, and that debate should be happening in public, right? So, like, you have the top advisors to the president, where he's assembled a group of people with potentially very disparate views, telling him, here's what we think we should do. And
Doctor, and talking to Mycroft, you have pretty much a solution very similar to my older brother last night. He said, you get the best scientists in the world who are not necessarily connected to the public health bureaucracy. You add in industry, because he's a product of 30 years of bringing drugs to market, and he knows that industry does things sometimes in its own interest, but they're interested in making money primarily, and they don't want to get sued. You put them together and you let them work it out with a lot of public access, and then you bring those answers to a select standing committee of House Democrats and Republicans, Senate Democrat and Republican, and you run it through elected representatives so that everybody sees the same data and you don't shut anybody down, but you only start with credentialed people. What do you think of that process?
I think a process like that might work. I mean, the question is like, how do you select? There's a lot of details, of course, but I think the key thing is you have to allow people with different ideas in the room. That didn't happen this time.
Right.
Systematically, so I actually got to meet with President Trump in August 2020. My friend Scott Atlas had been chosen by Trump to be his advisor. I before Scott is also a colleague of mine at Stanford, and I've been talking with him basically daily since early March 2020. Every time we saw a new study, I'd send it to him. We'd have phone calls discussing what the studies meant, and that continued when he was in the White House. Like I was just sending him papers, and he was sending me papers. It was really, it was, but he was telling me every day is like, Tony won't listen to the papers. I'm sending them papers. Debbie Birx won't listen to the papers. They're just not interested in talking about anything outside their own view. And he tried to organize a meeting between where he brought in outside experts, me, Martin Kulldorff, Joe Ladapo, and others, and they worked very hard to make sure that we didn't get in front of the president. They wanted to make sure that the president only heard one view. If you read Debbie Birx's book, that was the main concern that she had, was the making sure that the president only saw one view, her view, before in terms of the science of the pandemic. The contrast, I've had the honor of being able to advise Governor DeSantis during the pandemic about, and the way that he operated was in public, right? He'd invite me to a public roundtable along with other experts, and he would just ask us questions, what we thought about child masking, what we thought about lockdowns, what we thought, and so on and so forth. And the public could see what we were telling it. I think.
Is there any evidence at all from the beginning? I was right about one thing from the beginning, that it was coming from China and it was dangerous. And the second thing was, don't put masks on kids. Because I have small grandchildren who learn how to talk between the ages of 6 months and 3 years. If you put masks on them, they're going to have delayed speech, and I don't know when they'll recover. What did you think of that decision early on?
I thought it was crazy, Hugh. It is crazy. There's literally zero randomized evidence that would stop the disease spread. And anyone that has a child understands you can't. You put a mask on, they're gonna touch it, they're gonna pull it, what? I mean, it's just not. It just didn't make any sense. And you're right. I think there. I mean, I don't know that. I'm not a pediatric developmental expert, but I'll tell you, like, I've gotten a lot of moms and dads writing to me saying, "Look, my kid doesn't know how to talk as well as he should. He doesn't know how to socialize as well as he should." Especially hearing impaired moms and dads will tell me about their kids' trouble with masks. We were out of line with the rest of the world. The World Health Organization didn't even recommend masking anyone under 6. And the European CDC's no one under 12, and the U.S. said mask 2-year-olds. I mean, it was entirely science free. I have no idea why they
contradiction, doctor. The WHO has zero credibility in my eyes because Tedros obviously was doing the Chinese bidding early in the cover-up. I will never have any confidence in the WHO. What is your opinion of the WHO now?
I think it needs fundamental, thoroughgoing reform. I completely agree with you. It seems like a political organization. Except in this case, it's an internationally political organization. It's like the UN. I have to say, there are some good scientists there, and there I think a lot of good people that want to do good things there. So I don't want to paint all of them with too broad a brush. But the organization as a whole, I think. In February 2020, they sent a mission to China, a WHO mission to China. Tony Fauci sent his deputy Cliff Lane on this mission, and they came back having not actually have ever gone to Wuhan or Hubei. They I think they went just to Beijing, met with some Chinese leaders, and then came back and wrote a report saying what China did in January 2020 worked, albeit at great cost. It said. That they conquered the disease by their draconian lockdown. And then they recommended the world do it. That's the world. WHO basically is then responsible for all of the harms to the poor of the world caused by these lockdowns. 100 million people thrown
Yeah,
into poverty.
Doctor, does the Public Health Service and public health officials know anything about communists and Leninists? I don't know anything about science, but I know Leninism and communism, and I know they lie when they need to perpetuate their power. They welded people into buildings in Wuhan. That's why I was scared, is I saw what the communists were doing without regard for the liberty and life of their own people, and I said, oh my gosh, this is bad. In fact, they were just trying to protect themselves from what they didn't know, and I think from culpability for what they did. So, what do we do in a world going forward where we can't trust the largest country in the world? I mean, literally can't trust them.
I mean, I guess I was very naive at the beginning of the pandemic. I thought, okay, there's certainly politics. You don't trust, when they say that they're disarming or something, you don't trust that. That's one thing. But like, the scientific field, I mean, I have Chinese colleagues that are excellent scientists who I think are I mean, not on virology, but on other areas. Um, so I don't see how science works unless you have that kind of trust. And China is among the largest producers of biomedical science in the world. Like, I think they actually produce more papers than the United States in biomedical sciences. Um, if we have to stop trusting the Chinese science, it's going to be a major problem, Hugh. And I think,
Well, we have to,
unfortunately,
Doctor.
yeah, I mean,
It's like trusting Soviet science during I was talking to Mycroft last night. He said, look, the only place that should be doing gain of function, and we should be doing gain of function, is at Fort Detrick with the very best scientists in the world and take a level 5 and build a level 10, because we can't let this out, and you don't let China do this because they're not good at that level. No central command and control Leninist organization is. I don't think we'll ever be able to trust them on anything, Doctor, for the foreseeable future, because they're not a free society.
yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to that, Hugh. But I have to say, I guess I disagree about the gain of function. I think it should just be banned. I think it's like, well, these comprehensive test ban treaties we have with nuclear weapons. I don't actually see a use for them, right? The use case is that we predict the next pandemic. We figure out which viruses are likely to make the leap, and then prepare in advance with vaccines and so on. But if on the other hand you have this possibility of a leak, and actually, I gotta say, even Fort Detrick, I'm not sure I trust to stop. Again, I'll tell you why I don't trust. It's not intentional. I think the problem is when you're doing experiments, most of the work you're doing is just drudgery. It's long, boring. You're just and if you have to then protect yourself at every instant against the possibility of exposure, it's not possible. There's leak after leak. There's history of leak after leak after leak. In 2021, in Taiwan, there was a lab in Taiwan with essentially high security lab in Taiwan studying this virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, that had a leak. A high security lab. I mean,
That's why Mycroft said the United States and our closest allies only, and with tight controls. But he did see some benefit. That's a rabbit hole. I want to get back to the main thing. Doctor, what is your view of mRNA research and vaccines generally? Open-ended question, just your general reaction to it. What do you want the public to know?
I think it's a promising platform, but it has wrinkles that need to be worked out. And I think if there had not been a worldwide pandemic of this scope, we would never have relied on it at this point at scale. And I think we've learned a lot from its use during the pandemic in terms of the side effect profiles of this vaccine. The question is are the side effect profiles unique to this vaccine, or is it something inherent to the mRNA platform? Are there modifications we can make to the technology? I mean, at the beginning of when I first heard about the technology being deployed, I actually had high hopes that maybe it would be possible to use it as a platform for lots and lots and lots of vaccines. It seems quite promising in that way. Um, but at this point, I don't know. I think it's going to take a lot more work and a lot more study, a lot more development to make sure that we can control the side effects that we've seen. That the side effects we've seen, like the myocarditis in young men, it isn't caused by the mRNA platform, but rather by the antigen, the spike protein antigen or whatever. I think we need to learn quite a bit more. The technology itself is a couple of decades long in coming, but it had failed in use in cancer studies before the pandemic. And this was really the first real human use of it. And so we shouldn't be surprised that it has had some hiccups. So I think I guess it's promising, but not yet ready for. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, I would have said it's not yet ready for prime time.
Is the scientific community being forthright about the side effects that we are now learning about COVID, about long COVID, about spike proteins, and about the mRNA? Mycroft says the myocarditis research is showing us that if you've got young men in your family, you might not want to have them. They might be also, if they get COVID, they might have myocarditis as well. But he's very skeptical about very young children in the vaccine. What's your general view right now about getting the vaccine for the youngest and the adolescent boys?
I don't think that they ever needed it. I mean, their likelihood of dying from COVID was minuscule. And sometimes people will compare the risk of myocarditis with COVID versus the vaccine, but that's the wrong comparison, right? The vaccine does not stop you from getting COVID. I mean, I had the vaccine in April of 2021, and 4 months later, I had COVID. So what the vaccine then does is gives you a second draw at myocarditis. Now, you might get some benefit. Like older people, I argue to take the vaccine because it reduces the likelihood of dying if you get COVID. So you get an offsetting benefit. But for young men, the offsetting benefit is tiny, if at all, because they don't likely to die from COVID. And so you end up with two draws at the myocarditis slot machine instead of just one. So I don't think it was ever really appropriate, and especially now that you have such widespread immunity in the population, I think there's really not a very good argument for giving the vaccine to that younger people.
What about the general review of the side effects of the COVID vaccine? Online, you will find for every balanced, nuanced presentation like yours, Doctor, you'll find people screaming from both the left and the right about what is best and what is worse about that. I don't know who to believe, but is there good scientific follow-up on side effects in your view?
So I think there have been some excellent studies of side effects, but unfortunately, most of them were not conducted in this country, right? So, for instance, we learned about strokes with the adenovirus vaccines fairly early on from studies in outside the U.S. We learned about myocarditis actually from great studies in Qatar, Denmark, a few other places. The U.S. has been slow to pick up these signals, and the media environment has made it almost impossible to get the word out when those signals are found. Right? The idea is that somehow, if you tell the truth about some of these side effects, I mean, myocarditis in young men is as well established as any side effect. I've done vaccine safety research for a decade, and this is a pretty well established finding. And yet, if you say it, somehow you're an anti-vaxxer. That label has led many people in science and public health in the United States to essentially, scale back their criticism of or warnings about the vaccine that are legitimate. And so it's I can understand why, right? The idea is that, in the past there have been illegitimate criticisms of vaccines, side effect profiles that don't exist. Does MMR, measles vaccine cause autism? Well, no, the evidence is that it doesn't. And yet, that idea has led many people to say, well, I shouldn't vaccinate my child with measles. Well, we shouldn't allow that kind of conversation at all. But instead, what's happened then is you combine that with the vaccine mandates. You combine that with the fact that there actually are people who are vaccine injured by this vaccine. We've created an anti-vax movement on the heels of basically it's public health's fault has created this. They have gassed people.
Gosh, thank you for saying that. There's a great, I don't know if you remember or particularly followed the Lebanon civil war, but it got to the point that they had a green line in the middle of Beirut. And on one side were the Shia militias, and on the other side were the Christian and Sunni militias. And you didn't go near the green line because you're going to get shot if you went near the green line. The green line now in the COVID world is everything. Nobody wants to go near anything because you're going to get ravaged by both sides if you get close to the green line. And I see a complete collapse of public exchange, which is why I'm interested in the Norfolk group and your call for a COVID commission? Because we got to get past the civil war in science. And do you agree with me about that?
I can entirely agree. I mean, I've been in this business for a long time, Hugh, and I've never felt this environment, such an environment. I mean, for 2 years, whenever I would say anything or write anything, I would get death threats in 2020, 2021. I would get, and worse than death threats, I was essentially excommunicated by my own, I was afraid to walk on my own university. There were, because I would speak with Governor DeSantis, and there would be like posters all over campus accusing me of killing people in Florida for the crime of saying you shouldn't mask toddlers. Um, uh, you know, it's one of these things where, like, if you have an environment where you're going to get smeared if you say what you honestly think, you're not going to say what you honestly think, and that is, a lot of scientists did that. There was this, if you cross Tony Fauci or Francis Collins, you're going to get a devastating takedown on you. What that led to is a lot of scientists silencing themselves, censoring themselves, and so the idea that what they were saying represented some sort of consensus, that was self-created. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of people stopped disagreeing with them because they were afraid of the treatment that I got.
Now, you know what Dr. Fauci did with me, Doctor? The moment I said, would you consider resigning? He stopped coming on the show. Francis Collins stopped coming on the show. And his staff said, what, are you out of your nuts? You asked him to resign. I'm not coming on the show. That's an indifferent to intelligent criticism that is indicative of a very closed mind and a very thin skin. We don't need thin skin. This leads me to my age question. I think Arthur Brooks is right. You go through a long learning period of fluid intelligence, and you have crystallized intelligence, and then you have declining crystallized intelligence. Do you think anyone over the age of 70 ought to be leading any public health bureaucracy? I just don't think they're nimble enough.
I mean, I think I know some people over 70 that are still quite nimble. So I don't think it's quite age exactly, but I do think there's some sort of, I've maybe this is unfair. This is definitely unfair, but I had been thinking, like, just as a joking thing, as I've been calling, with friends, Tony Fauci is like J. Edgar Fauci, right? It's not so much the nimbleness of mind. He's very clearly, obviously, quite bright and still quite nimble. I think the problem is that he was so used to power that he wasn't used to having people contradict him. That was the fundamental problem. Like, he basically sat atop this huge pile of money, and it wasn't just money. Like, I have tenure at Stanford, in medical school at Stanford University, in part because I have been successful in earning NIH grants. That's a marker of success in American biomedicine. If I don't have NIH grants, then I don't get tenure. A lot of people, that means that person and that position has still has social power.
Oh my, I hadn't thought about that. Talk about a secondary effect which is devastating: the silencing of young academics who do not want to fall out of favor with the credentialing apparatus that is NIH.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key reform idea out of that, Hugh, is that person, whoever it is, it doesn't matter what their age is to me, but that person, whoever it is, should play a very small role in health policy, if at all. Because when they put their stamp on some health policy position or public health position, everyone's going to fall in line because they're afraid for their careers. That position is too powerful to allow that. So it should be a conflict of interest, be seen as a conflict of interest, to have someone who's the head of the NIH or head of the NIAID weighing in on matters of public health and public policy directly. Their job is to fund excellent science.
I want to go through first your reaction to the variety of political experiences we had. We had some neo-totalitarian regimes. You're familiar with Hillsdale College. You're familiar with Michigan. You're also familiar with Florida. You're familiar with New York. You're familiar with California. We had this series. We have a federalism system. First, your thoughts on federalism as a political solution to this. And then secondly, how do you explain the very vast disparity between, for example, the most authoritarian regime, which is in Michigan, in my view, and the least authoritarian, which is Florida? Why were they that way? Were they politically that way, or were they driven by particular advisory communities to go that way?
Well, I think the governors in this country have tremendous power. I've learned during the pandemic. I didn't realize quite to the extent the power that they have. You had in Michigan, you had a governor that used her authority to ban selling seeds for some reason, or toys, right? While her husband is like going off on a yacht trip or something. And whereas in Florida, you had a governor whose main idea was like, how can we uh, support our kids? How can we protect older people from this? He organized a campaign to make sure that older people got monoclonal antibodies in their home when they got sick in 2021. He made sure I helped. I was an expert in this case for opening schools in Florida because when the governor ordered schools to open in August of 2020, the teachers union sued the governor, and they couldn't. I mean, what he was trying to do is say, look, let's have in-person school. People have a right to an education. I think the governor plays now. I think federalism generally is quite a good thing. I mean, thank God we have Florida. Thank God we have Sweden. So now we have a control group. We can see, okay, what worked and what didn't work. But I think broadly speaking, the power of public health, the emergency power of public health, is probably too much. It's just too much. You have to have some capacity to push back. I think if I understand, the legislator in Michigan did push back eventually, limiting the power of the governor, ending reducing during a state of emergency, which I think was quite a good thing. I mean, that's another good thing about separation of powers in this country.
At the time, Attorney General Barr came on the program and said, we are close to the limit of constitutional authority. I think we passed it in many places, and I don't think we'll do that again because we are a learning society. I was reading with great interest on the day before our conversation. You posted on Twitter a list of the broad impacts, including in health, the economy, income, education, food security, lifestyle, relationships, community, environment, and governance. I agree with you. Everything got worse because of COVID. And I mean, in some cases, significantly worse. Do you think that has been absorbed by the public health bureaucracy, or are they simply... You see, I can be wrong. I've been wrong so often on the air. I'm just used to being wrong. I don't mind telling people I'm wrong. But in your world, you really can't step up and say you're wrong. I mean, you can, but generally, if you're at the NIH, you can't walk out and say, boy, did we boot that one.
But we ought to have a culture where that allows that to happen. I mean, that's how science is. Like most of the time, scientists are wrong. We have a hypothesis, and it turns out to be wrong. That is just, if you're not wrong most of the time in science, you're not doing science. Right? Because you're just parroting back what everyone already knows, and that's not really science. That's something else, right? Science is, I have some phenomena where it's complicated and no one really knows. I have an idea how it works, and I test it, and if the test doesn't work out, then I'm wrong. I say that. That's part of how science is. Public health ought to embrace that as well, right? We should be much more humble in public health about being wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong with being wrong. It's what's wrong with is if you persist in it and then push policies around it based on things that have been long established to be wrong. That's the problem.
Well, what about the danger when you've got a virus that moves via the air? I mean, that's the most dangerous thing. Aerosols, I believe, is the term you used, and you don't know what it does to whom. How long do you stay, as I was, in a crouch because I had read The Great Influenza and I was worried that it was coming from China and they didn't care? How long do you stay in the crouch?
I mean, the problem is that it's going to be very different for different people depending on their life circumstances, right? So a single mom who has to go out and feed or earn something so they can feed her child can't stay in a crouch for very long, and so we have to design policies that work for everybody. I mean, so for something like that. And so it's just going to be, I mean, no matter what, you have a pandemic with a virus like this, it's going to cause damage. I mean, it's just unfortunate. I think that part of the problem is like we made this like completely impossible promise that we will protect you if you just listen to us, no matter who you are. We just didn't have that capacity. We had to be honest with people. This is going to be hard. This is going to be tough. There's going to be difficulties. But the sacrifices we asked people to make should have been closely tied to really good evidence that they were going to yield some good outcomes, and closely with a deep understanding of the harms that we were doing to people and efforts to mitigate those harms. Like,
would it help if public health officials said at the very beginning, we're going to be wrong and we will tell you when we're wrong, and we're going to change our minds, and we're going to tell you when we change our minds, and we're going to do it all in open, and please just understand that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an unfolding train crash, and we have to be wrong in order to get to right. Do you think we can ever get that kind of approach in public health again?
I well, I think it's absolutely necessary if we're going to ever get public trust in public health. I mean, I don't know, how does this work during war? I mean, like, you lose a battle, you have to make some announcement, right? You have to say, look, we lost this battle, but here's our strategy. I mean, I guess maybe the need for a public conversation in war is maybe less than in public health. We're not asking for
Yeah, that may
sacrifices
not be a
from.
good analogy because we lie. A bodyguard of lies was Churchill's view of the truth. Truth must be protected by a bodyguard of lies in a war. And that's not the same as a public health emergency. In a
Yeah,
war,
I mean,
you got to win the war.
yeah, I mean, there you're trying to trick the enemy. There's no trick. There's no
Yes,
enemy here, really. There's really, I mean,
correct.
there's the virus, and that's our foe. But I mean, we live in a world where we're just surrounded by pathogens. This is, in fact, we live symbiotically with a tremendous number of them. It's a very complicated relationship. It's not simply a war. So you're absolutely right. The war is a bad analogy. Um, and so, and for public health, the main thing that we possess in public health is public trust. If we lose that, we really lose our capacity. I mean, Sweden didn't mandate the vaccine, and yet they got very, very high uptake. Why? Because public health would say, look, early in the pandemic, they made huge mistakes, right? So early in the pandemic, the Stockholm nursing homes they did exactly the same thing that Andrew Cuomo did. They sent COVID infected patients back to nursing homes in Stockholm. A lot of people died that didn't need to die as a result of that mistake. By the way, if focused protection of vulnerable older people had been the primary thing instead of protection of flattening the curve or whatever, that never would have happened. Right. But anyways, that's
Yeah,
another.
that your excess. Also, yesterday you put out the changes in non-COVID excess deaths identified by Samurachi 2022. My gosh, I'm blown away by this. We had a lot of excess deaths because we shut down the country in a lot of things. I mean, what
Still
stands
happening.
out, doctor? What?
It's still happening. I mean, I think, and the problem, Hugh, is that we're going to have these problems that go on for a very long. A lot of women are going to show up with late stage breast cancer that should have been caught earlier because of we told people that cancer was less bad than COVID. We're going to have a lot of men with prostate cancer that were, again, the screening was skipped. Children. There was an estimate by this editor of JAMA Pediatrics in 2020, mid 2020, from just the spring closures of schools. You close schools for a short period of time, you think, okay, we can make it up, but it's really hard to make it up. And in some cases, we have a year or a half or more of school closures. The consequences of that are that our kids are going to be living poorer, shorter, less healthy lives, and that's what the editor of JAMA Pediatrics wrote in 2020. We're going to see this tail of harms of the lockdown continue for a very, very long time, unfortunately. The opioid epidemic, the deaths from anxiety and depression and suicide, we're just starting to see some of that. And it's the question is, how do we address it? Sweden has lower all cause mortality than the United States by a long shot. It's not even close.
Doctor, what do we know about long COVID? What do you think people should know about long COVID right now? What is it? How widespread? What should we do with the patients who believe they are suffering from it and have been diagnosed with it?
Yeah, so I think we have to be very sensitive about how we talk about this, because there are people who are legitimately suffering from sort of long-term lingering effects from recovery from COVID. And part of that, if you were hospitalized with COVID or in an ICU, it's going to take a long time to recover, no matter who you are, right? It doesn't, in fact, no matter what the virus is, that led you to have that. So there's that. There's also people who have you know like they still haven't recovered their sense of smell after they lost it during COVID. Um, I mean, that's so there's some people like that. But then there's a larger number of people with very, very with symptoms that overlap with lots and lots of other things, right? So uh, and that syndrome is harder to define and harder to understand from a strictly biological sense. We still don't have a biomarker, for instance, for why someone might have lingering fatigue or brain fog, or whatever. I would call it fatigue more than brain fog. That's too a term that's like designed to get you to do something particular. Like, why would you have lingering fatigue or lingering, sort of these kinds of like non-specific symptoms? Um, Part of that is tied up with, if you were really, really scared of COVID and you get it, there's gonna be problems in the long run. And I don't mean to like say that that's not real, because it is real for someone suffering. That is absolutely is real. The question is, how do you best treat that and prevent that? Um, that's the question, and how you and we're still sort of gaining an understanding of that syndrome. I think. I'd say a few things. Like one is that there seem to be like some promising treatments. So there was just a recent randomized trial that suggests that metformin, a cheap drug used for treat diabetes, actually treats long COVID symptoms. Um, so there are these new studies that are coming out. Second, I think um, the idea that you can prevent yourself from getting COVID in order to prevent long COVID, I think, is the same fallacy we made all the way across. I mean, long COVID is one of the many bad things that can happen in your life relative to 10,000 other bad things. If you structure your life in order to avoid COVID and thereby avoid long COVID, you're going to miss out a lot on your life, and you're going to harm yourself in ways I think will be worse than the probability of getting long COVID, especially given that there seem to be advances in how we manage it.
That's helpful. Doctor, tell me about, before I go to some questions that the audience submitted for you, and I want to be appreciative of your time. I don't want to take you too long. So I got about 30 more minutes of questions. Tell me about the Norfolk group, how it originated, what it recommended, because a COVID commission, like the 9/11 commission, could either be a very good commission or it could be a very bad commission, depending on who's on it and what it's supposed to do.
So actually, Phil Zelikow, who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, actually led a commission to try to answer questions about this. And he, if you read his report, it's just an entirely conventional thing. It's like, well, how come? Essentially, the theme seems to be, why didn't we lock down earlier, faster, better? Misses out on all of the questions that we've asked during this talk. The Norfolk group essentially is scientific questions like, what was the evidence to close schools? What happened in places that didn't close schools to kids that versus in terms of disease spread, in terms of school outcomes? What was the evidence on masking? What evidence was it that mass masking actually slowed the spread of the disease versus what harms did it cause? Why did we ignore immunity after COVID recovery in our recommendations about the vaccine? When was the evidence about immunity known? When was it? Why was it not? Why was it essentially hidden from the public for so long? What was the evidence about breakthrough infections with the vaccines? When was that known? How, to what extent would it have been better to recommend the vaccine primarily for older people and then make it optional for younger people? What effect did the vaccine mandates have on public trust in vaccines? Questions.
When did we learn that the vaccine didn't stop transmission? When did we learn that? And did we tell people that at the time? Because that's a very dangerous thing not to know.
Well, I mean, in December 2020, when I read that trial, it was clear I didn't know. I mean, I noticed that they didn't check whether the vaccine stopped transmission in the trial. So when I looked at that, I said, okay, I don't want to say that it stops transmission when I don't know it. And so I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying we should use this vaccine for protecting older people, because I was pretty sure it would reduce mortality risk, although that wasn't the primary endpoint of the trial. But if it prevented symptomatic infection, then it probably prevented death, right? So that was my reasoning. And so I recommended using the vaccine to protect older people, but not for herd immunity, not for stopping prevention of transmission when we didn't know that it prevented transmission. And then, I don't know, by spring 2021, it was really clear from other countries. Like, first, the Seychelles Islands had this major outbreak despite being widely vaccinated, but they used the Chinese vaccine. I'm like, okay, maybe the Chinese vaccine doesn't work well for transmission. Then I saw Israel had a massive outbreak despite being heavily vaccinated. By late spring, it was really clear to me that it wasn't stopping transmission. I have no idea why it took the CDC so long to decide that. And I just saw an email the other day from January 2021 from Rochelle Walensky to Francis to others at the CDC, saying she spoke with Francis Collins, saying that talking about a study about variants and how it was quite possible there were going to be breakthrough infections with the vaccine. January 2021, she knew. Why did they then go on and say that we have to force everyone to get vaccinated to get the disease to go away? Tony Fauci went around saying 70, 80% of the population will get herd immunity. He didn't understand what herd immunity was. Herd immunity is not a synonym for the disease going away. Herd immunity is just a synonym. It means that a sufficient number of people have some protection against the virus because of either for the vaccine or because of prior recovery from prior disease. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
you're being very careful. I am too. This is not a kick Dr. Fauci in the butt conversation, although we could do that for a long period of time. This is a what do we do next? On the COVID commission, if one comes together. I know you would put 3-year Letterman on it, right?
I love him. He's fantastic, and I never lettered in anything either. So
Well, we need a youth coach and 3-year Letterman. But I mean, who would you actually put on the commission? What kind of people?
well, I think there can be a broad range of scientific views on it, right? So I would put Martin Kulldorff on it for sure. If I could get convinced Sunetra Gupta to come up from the UK, I would put her on it. But I do think that we need to have people that were on the other. I would love to have Mike Osterholm on it, for instance. I would love to have there are a lot of honest scientists on the other side who disagreed with me. I would love to have some of those folks on it. We need a very very broad range of people. Um, I think it's very very important to people to put the critics of the policy on it because we were basically locked out of discussion, essentially sent to the fringe, excommunicated from the scientific conversation during the pandemic. And about a lot of those scientific fact points, we were right. Um, and so I think having that us represent, this is the problem with Phil Zeliko's commission. I spoke with him when he organized the commission, and then he didn't ask me to go on it. And if you read the commission, there's almost no representation of any of the contrary of the.
Yeah, it's got no traction. It will never, because there are no credible critics of what we did. On the other hand, I don't want. Alex Berenson's a friend of mine, been a guest on the show for a long time. He writes great thrillers. I don't believe anything he writes about this. I got a bunch of friends in that category who are like me. They're smart people who have no idea about how to read a scientific article about COVID and just absolutely no capacity to do other than reflect who they want to talk about. So there's got to be a bridge group of people who translate. You're one of them, but there've got to be more of them who have credibility on the. They're not with anti-vaxxers. You're not an anti-vaxxer. You're a critic of our COVID response. Is that a fair categorization? Anti-vaxxers,
Absolutely.
critics of the COVID response, all in COVID people.
Well, I mean, anti-vaxxer. I mean, it's just essentially like a slur right now, right? It's like you're trying to
Right.
again, you're trying to communicate somebody. By the way, Alex read the evidence on early on the infection blocking of the vaccine. He read it correctly, actually. So I have a lot of just a kudos out to Alex for that. That was I learned from him on that.
But he was wrong a lot, Doctor. I know Al. I love him. I read everything he writes, but he was wrong often and got excitable. That's the problem.
I mean, we all have our style, right?
Yeah.
But I think but Alex is not a scientist. He's a journalist, and he's trying to reflect on
Correct.
you. I think there's nothing. I mean, like I said, I've benefited quite a lot from it, my interactions with Alex. But I do think that this commission needs to have a very very wide range of views. I think scientists belong on this commission, as do some politicians. Like I think those were the primary sets of people that belong on this commission. The scientists, and
I
if you
would
want the media.
I would put the head of the networks on. I would get a couple of senior news people because they're partly responsible for, Dan Rather famously allegedly said news is where you look. All of major media, all of legacy media didn't look anywhere except Tony Fauci, Deborah Birx, and Francis Collins. And so the news media failed completely. I really do believe that. And I'm among them. I'm among the people who failed. I didn't even know you existed until Larry Arnn told me about you. So there.
Larry seems to be my best publicist. He's fantastic. He kept Hillsdale open. He told me that the Michigan DA essentially was like threatening to put him in jail if he had a.
Don't go overboard complimenting Arnn. I've been dealing with him for 30 years. We cannot let his ego get any bigger. The only 3 people he listens to in the world are named Penny, Charlotte, and you. So I don't want to give him any other props, but he does listen to you, and he was interested in finding smart people who would advise him about holding college because college mattered to him, and so they did.
Yeah. I mean, I think the world of him. He's one of the leaders that stood up, and it took some guts. I mean, same thing with like someone like Ron DeSantis, Kristi Noem, some others. You could actually just to give some props to the other side, to the Democrats. I would say like Jared Polis pushed to open schools very early. Yeah, for among Democrats, that was very, very brave. So I think there are leaders that have stood out during the pandemic, but I think that I think uh, you're right. You're absolutely right. The commission should have not just scientists, but it should have media figures. It should have political leaders also on it, and it should be represented widely. But I think the agenda should not be focused simply on what like the Zellico report. That's like the Whig history of it's like a just trying to like whitewash the
Well said. I want to know what to do because I got grandkids and they're going to be pandemics and they've got to get a better response. Let me get to some of my questions, doctor, in my last 22 minutes. I'm an MA physical therapy from Stanford, 1972. I would like to know if Dr. J has ever received an apology from the Stanford medical community, either publicly or privately.
There's been some folks that have come up and said, I mean, that I've reconciled. I'm a Christian. I'm supposed to forgive. If I've had a lot of practice forgiving Hugh, and so I guess there's that one good thing to come of it. And I've had some nice reconciliations with some folks, but nothing official. Stanford failed. The academic freedom. I love Stanford. Or have loved Stanford. I've been there for 37 years. What we failed as an institution to live up to our greatest, sort of our highest missions, which was to protect academic freedom, so that open conversations on difficult topics could happen.
I never even thought about young scholars, young medical researchers cut off from NIH. That's like cutting off oxygen to an astronaut doing a spacewalk. That's really terrible. Second question. My question for the doctor is, how optimistic is he about moving forward when people like Matt Taibbi, Schellenberger are being able to change the polarizing narrative due to things like trust the science? Will the Twitter files change things so that Americans can rebuild trust?
I think we are at a crossroads. I mean, I think on the one hand, a lot of public health, institutional public health, is just closing up ranks, pretending like they did great, giving themselves awards, um, and we could end up with that history. If we end up with that history, we're gonna make the same mistake over and over and over again into perpetuity. Essentially, we will have we will no longer live in in a liberal republic. We will live in a scienceocracy, a technocracy. Um, that's one path. The other. I mean, I've testified in the House a couple of times during the last few months, and I've noticed like the Democrat, with some good exceptions like Ani Bera, but for the most part, they don't want to go back and like revisit what happened because they figured the only problem was misinformation, and all the problems were caused by misinformation. They want to essentially cement this kind of pandemic response into place. That's very
Well,
different than
there
other.
are some problems with misinformation, right, doctor? There is bad advice on the internet about vaccines, like measles vaccines.
Yeah, I mean,
We
I'm not saying there's not misinformation. I'm saying that was not the primary problems during the pandemic. I mean,
True.
misinformation is as old as the hills. Like J.S. Mill writing about misinformation in the late 19th century, and his response was, "Well, we need more speech." I think that that's still the right answer. I think, I think the other path is the path your listener suggests, right? So we return to an open society, a society that allows there to be discussion and doesn't look for a single person who says I am the science. Like we're not a society of gurus. We are a society of free citizens that talk to each other and learn from each other. I think those are
You
the two
know,
paths.
trust the science is now a cliche for don't believe anything that comes after this. When people say trust the science now, I have no idea what it means. Do you think that phrase has any utility anymore?
I think we should get rid of it. I think the problem is like like it's capital T capital S, and if it's capital T capital S science, it's not actually science. Little S science, I have I still am quite fond of, and still think is a great source of learning about the way the world works. But little less science is much more humble. It's people saying, "Well, yeah, gosh, I wonder if this is the way the world works." And then you say, "No, Jay, that it must work this other way." And we run a study or a test or an experiment, and you're right. And I say, "Oh, gosh, darn Hugh, you're right this time." And then now I've learned, and I go out and we do the next thing.
That brings me to I got like 6 questions from listeners who want to know the personal impact on Jay Bhattacharya. In other words, your journey has been difficult. You have been resolute. You've been calm. You haven't gotten angry with anyone in public, as far as I've seen. What has it done to you personally, and what ought you to? I mean, there's a book here for you to write about how to respond to being at the center of a storm and getting all the lightning shot at you.
I mean, I didn't have a choice. I mean, it's like I prepared my all the research I'd done through my career. It almost like looked like it pointed me to having to say this. If I didn't speak up now, there's no purpose in my career. I mean, I've like thought about Esther actually a bunch during the pandemic. You know, which she's the queen of Persia, and then all of a sudden she's like brought into this massive geopolitical fight. That's what it felt like for me. I was like, I just had to say what I had to say. For me personally, there've been so many broken friendships and so many. I mean, at one point early in the pandemic, I wasn't so used to the attention, the negative attention. You know, but there were these hit pieces on me, but mainly on like my family and my wife. I mean, I was so anxious. I lost 30 pounds. I couldn't sleep. The first time I'm usually, you ask my friends, I'm a very relaxed, laid back person. First time in my life, I couldn't sleep. I was like joke with my friends. I was going to write a diet book on how to lose 30 pounds during a pandemic. It was like I lost weight so fast I was afraid for my life. But then like things, I don't know. I prayed a lot. I found a lot of strength in that, and I found a
Interesting.
lot.
What's your religious denomination, Jay?
Presbyterian. I'm a Presbyterian.
Okay, you and Lonnie Chen are probably in the same church up there. Your
Yeah, we
congressman
actually
is
talked.
Ro Khanna. Yeah, I gathered. You know, all Presbyterians are like. Dr. J. Ro Khanna is your congressman. He's one of the smartest, though often wrong, members of Congress. Ro and I get together and we talk about stuff, and he's just wrong, but he's very smart. Have you talked with him about this?
I have not, although I have seen his defense of free speech, which I like. Um, I've been less happy with Anna Eshoo, who's not defended free speech. In fact, I had this one interaction, which funny interaction with her in my House testimony, where she essentially said, like, you know, I cited this email that Francis Collins wrote calling me a fringe epidemiologist. She called that just a professional dispute. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think locally it's been a mixed bag. I mean, I think
Oh,
there have been some leaders. Yeah.
my question for Dr. Bhattacharya is about the spike protein left in a person's body from the vaccine. For a lot of people, this is an allegation. I don't know if it's true. It is causing havoc in their bodies. Do you recommend nattokinase? Well, I don't know what these are, or products to get rid of this spike protein? I have no idea what that means, but I want to honor my audience.
So, I mean, I've looked a little bit at that. The clinical evidence, like I haven't seen any trials that convince me that those things work. I think there's some in vitro evidence of spike proteins hanging around for a while, but I don't think it's like common. I think most people that have the vaccine is cleared after you had it, shortly after you have it. So I think if you do have those kinds of conditions, I mean, it's like the folks who have long COVID. I mean, I think these are not things to just poo poo. Those are things that we ought to take seriously as scientists.
All right, I have two last questions, doctor, and I'll let you go. The first one is, what is the effectiveness of the vaccines for COVID? How to have the redactions of the weekly morbidity and mortality reports from a FOIA request be unredacted for greater public knowledge? And would you recommend COVID vaccines today? That's a three-parter, and I have one more after that three-parter.
Okay, so first part, I think the COVID vaccines in 2021 were useful for protecting older people from death. I think that's the primary thing that they did. They also caused some side effects that were really unfortunate, which may have harmed some people. And primarily, I think young men were harmed by the myocarditis risk from the vaccines. Um, the redactions. I mean, it's been interesting to watch people request basic communications among public health officials from in government. Right, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, allows Americans to take a peek and see what those discussions were. And these are not like classified documents. This is not, the analogy which you rejected. I agree with you should have rejected about war. This is not war. This is not secret things that need to be hidden. But then if you look at the FOIA responses from the government, they're like 80% redacted. Well, somebody did a FOIA request of the NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease 2020 research plan, written after the pandemic started. And it was entirely redacted. How does the public not get to know that?
I don't know.
So there's no good excuse. I mean, like basically, if you want to undermine trust in public health, you just keep redacting those FOIA requests and see what happens. Um, and then I'm sorry, I missed the third one.
Would you recommend a COVID vaccine today?
I think very few people probably need it today. I mean, I don't know your clinical circumstances, and you may be immunocompromised, and you may have other things that make you more likely that you need it than not. I think talk to your doctor, as with anything. But the vast majority of people who've already had COVID and recovered probably don't need it.
And my very last question, because it's a very interesting question. How would you keep the ERs from filling? That was the original purpose of the shutdowns. And this person has a memory for what we were trying to do: stop the spread, keep doctors from being overwhelmed, et cetera. How would you have accomplished that early on when we didn't know the infectious rate, the morbidity rate? We didn't know anything. What would you have done?
Focused protection of older people. We knew I looked at the data out of China in December 2020. It was really clear it was older people that were getting hospitalized and dying. So if you want to stop the spread of, or if you want to stop the filling of the ERs, protect older people from getting the disease. So don't send COVID-infected patients to nursing homes. The idea of like stopping the spread was hopeless the disease that was already out there in January 2020. There was a huge outbreak in Iran. There was that huge outbreak in Italy. It was already established in the population. Even in the U.S., there were already cases in January 2020, official cases. It's very likely to spread earlier than that. So that you just give up on. What you can do is protect older people, the people who fill the ERs up, from getting it. So protect nursing homes better. That would have protected ERs much better than trying to keep kids out of school.
Professor Ferguson wrote the book on catastrophes, and I was pretty influenced by it. And I came to the conclusion after that pandemics are generally going to pandemic. You can't stop them. You just can't. You can protect some people. That's where I am in 2023, is that a pandemic's going to come and you're not going to be able to stop it. Are you that resigned as I am now to pandemics are going to pandemic, save as many people as you know are most vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very, 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 very early point where you can say, okay, maybe we can get zero, a very, very early point, but it's often earlier than you think, right? So January 2020 was too late for this pandemic. SARS-1, it got to zero, basically, because we got it. It didn't spread the way that this did. It didn't spread by aerosols. So it would depend on the particular pathogen. You might be able to get to zero with focused interventions if you understand the transmissions and you've picked it up early enough. For most things like this, the flu is a good example. You're not going to get to zero. So it's either 0 or 100, nothing in between.
Dr. Bhattacharya, I appreciate a great, generous dollop of your time this morning. I hope you'll come back with the next generation of this. And you've been everything Larry Arnn promised, open, funny, accessible, and I appreciate the time. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much.